Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be hosting this discussion today. We are pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Two very significant events in the last 2 days, which we'll be focusing on before we go to the question and answer section. The first is just released literally within the last few hours, is the judicial or the outlines of the first steps of the judicial reform that has been talked about for years and certainly was a major issue during the election campaign, was a major promise, not just from the ruling party, the Likud, but also the religious Zionist parties, supported by the ultra-Orthodox party. So these reforms pretty much have wall-to-wall support from within the government. And the first, as I said, the first details were released today. There aren't too many shocks amongst them by new Justice Minister Yariv Levin, very much a confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and some of the highlights are what was talked about for a long time is the override clause, which means that basically since 1995, we talked about this in the past, but just as a refresher, since 1995, the High Court in Israel has given itself powers to overrule Knesset legislation if it finds it unreasonable, if it finds it in opposition to basic laws. It gave these basic laws a quasi-constitutional basis, which they didn't really ever have. Israel is one of the few countries in the world that does not have a written constitution. So in 1995, with the revolution by former head of Supreme Court Aaron Barak, that gave the High Court powers, A, that it did not have, and B, went further, arguably. This is certainly the argument that's been made by the current government and various people who are propelling this reform, that Aaron Barak gave High Court more control, more activism than in any democracy in the world. And that's certainly something that's been argued by many jurists and academics. So since then, the High Court in Israel has basically decided what it can rule on the basis of what it calls reasonability, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And if any law they believe contravenes one of the basic laws, which, as I said, is a sort of super law, which stands above the regular laws, then they can strike it down. And they've struck down many laws throughout the decades ever since. This is something, especially on the right, which has been a major, major issue. One could certainly see much of what is being talked about today. One of the, let's just say, proponents, originators of this reform is now head of the Knesset Committee on Law, Justice and Constitution, Simcha Rotman. Just as a little plug, on Monday we'll be having Simcha on a webinar, Middle East Forum webinar, talking about this and why he feels it's necessary for Israel's challenges in security and diplomacy. And obviously he can explain some of these issues in far greater detail with far greater expertise than I can. So if you're interested to hear more about it, tune in on Monday, I believe 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 9 o'clock Israel time. But anyway, the point is that this is going to be a massive change, 3 decades of change, where the Knesset will regain power to override the Supreme Court. In other words, if the Knesset passes a law that the Supreme Court then decides it doesn't pass its test of reasonableness, especially against one of the basic laws, the Knesset with a absolute majority of 61 can then re-legislate it and can ensure that it passes even against the objections of the Supreme Court. What proponents would argue that it rebalances or recalibrates the power, the balance between the 3 powers, which is government, legislature, and the judicial system. the right and the current coalition has argued for a long time that these unelected officials who basically elect themselves, which is another element we'll go into in a second, basically have more power than the representatives of the people, the democratically elected representatives of the people, and they would like to pass the balance back more towards the elected representatives of the people and away from the unelected members of the justice system. There is a bit more nuance to it than that, and Yair Levin has promised that all these issues will get a full debate and a full hearing from all sides during the legislative process, which is going to undertake soon. Another, as I said to you before, they're going to get rid of this test of reasonableness, which they said can, again, this is what the coalition will claim, that it can be abused, that it doesn't really mean anything, it doesn't exist in other judicial systems, and it's basically just a sort of made-up term that allows the justice system to disqualify what it likes. Interestingly enough, and this is really crucial from a political point of view, all of this is happening the day before the High Court is going to discuss whether Aryeh Deri, as we know, twice convicted of tax offenses and others, can serve as a minister. He is, at the moment at least, Interior Minister and Health Minister. He was convicted once, sat in prison, and then had to, go into semi-retirement from politics for 7 years because his sentence included moral turpitude, and then he came back to politics. And last year he accepted a plea bargain, which would see him resign from Knesset for, again, tax offences. The Attorney General, which is going to be another reform, her job is supposed to be to defend the government, and the government passed, or the coalition passed, a law which changed a basic law, or amended a basic law, to ensure that Aryeh Deri could serve as a minister, even though before that it said that a minister who had been convicted of criminal offences, etc., cannot serve as a minister. So they changed that, and at the moment he can serve. Now this basically 3 petitioners from outside government, this is again something relatively unique to the Israeli system, have petitioned the High Court to annul Aryeh Deri's appointment as minister. And the Attorney General for the government basically said that she cannot justify this law, or I should say, cannot justify Deri's appointment. It said it's an extreme element of unreasonableness, again, going back to that term. Don't ask me about some of these legal aspects because, they may be above my head, save them maybe for Simcha on Monday. But basically, there's a lot of ironies here, because she did say that she cannot justify and she cannot stand, as is her role, in the High Court and justify Aryeh Deri's appointment. But she did say that it should be outside the scope of the High Court's work because they changed a basic law. And as I said to you before, one of the complaints on the right is that a basic law should not be challenged. It has higher powers than a regular law, which is exactly what Aaron Barak brought in 1995. So there's a certain irony that a government that is seeking to change the nature of the judicial system's relationship to basic laws relies on that same basic law to ensure that, or to try and argue that the High Court does not have standing on this particular case. It's quite quite complex. I hope I've been able to just give you a little bit around the edges of what is going on, but it is, it's for the right. This is something that they've been waiting for a long time in the elections. The right has argued against the power of the court. They believe that the Supreme Court, at least for the last almost 3 decades, has very much tilted to the left, and they have arguably, I haven't looked statistically, but arguably shot down more laws of the right-wing government than the left-wing government. And again, another crucial reform that Justice Minister Yair Levin is trying to bring in is trying to change the balance of who appoints the judicial bench. At the moment, the balance is from the judicial system. But what Yariv Levin is arguing, that there should be more of a balance towards, again, legislators, towards the public representatives. So there's two at the moment. I believe it's there's a panel of nine on the appointments committee, 3 from the government, 4 from the judicial system judges, sitting judges, and then there's 2 from the Bar Association. The argument is the Bar Association is very much people within that system that tilts what the right would argue is more liberal, more left-wing, against right-wing causes. So it's basically 6 against 3. And, there's no chance of really going against that system to some extent. What your Levin's reforms will do is take those 2 from the Bar Association and give them to individuals, public individuals of their choice, which will then tilt back towards the government, the elected officials, because 3 + 2 will be 5, which is a majority in 9. So that's another thing. So there's a really, really, massive changes ahead. It really could reshape the way Israel legislature works, the judicial oversight. Is it a threat to democracy? No. It's again, to give both sides, the right would say all we're doing is trying to go in line with countries like America, which has more political interaction with the judicial system, which doesn't have such an activist court. The Supreme Court in the US sees a fraction of the amount of cases that the Israel Supreme Court has, and the right would argue that we're just taking ourselves back to the pre-1995 vision, where there's more balanced vision between the 3 powers of government, and that's what the right would argue. The left is very much, or let's say not even the left, but the members of the previous government, the current opposition, are outraged by this. They say that this is all to do with politics. It's all to do with Aryeh Deri's case, and more in the background, but certainly more, they would argue more prominently, to do with Netanyahu's court proceedings against him. They say Netanyahu only became enamored with the whole issue of judicial reform with the start of the cases against him. That's what they argue, that this is all personally motivated, politically motivated, that this is an attack of democracy, that they need judicial activism, judicial oversight to make sure there's not a tyranny of the majority, a term that has been used quite a lot by opponents in Israel over the last few days on that. Again, I would really recommend to tune in on Monday to get a far deeper understanding of this, certainly from a point of view of a proponent of it. The other big issue that came up this week was new national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir went up to the Temple Mount. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir, this is not his first time he's been up to the Temple Mount. He's been up, I don't know if it's dozens or hundreds, but certainly many, many times as an individual, as a member of Knesset. But now this is the first time as a government official, as a minister in a government. And to many people, it felt very, very different. The interesting thing here is that he said in advance that he would go up. And as one can imagine, there was a lot of condemnation internally and externally. One can imagine Prime Minister Netanyahu probably didn't get a minute from all the calls from international leaders, from ambassadors, from foreign officials, etc., telling him that he shouldn't do it, this is a danger, etc., etc. And what seemed to be a walk back later in the same evening, Itamar Ben-Gvir himself said that I will be going up at some point in the next few weeks. So walking back that he's going to go tomorrow and saying he'll go at some point in the next few weeks. What actually occurred is first thing in the morning, Itamar Ben-Gvir did go up for a relatively short visit. Everyone liked to time it around 12 or 13 minutes. Some mocked him from his opponents, saying, he went up, when no one could create any sort of opposition, and he sort of, went very, very quickly and then was down just as a show. That's what the opponents of the particular internal opponents. And there was these arguments that it's going to set off a terrible escalation, perhaps Hamas would get involved and others and whatever. In the end, it did. nothing really happened. There weren't any riots, there weren't any rockets. Apparently there was one rocket that basically was launched from Gaza and landed in Gaza. Some of them do, probably from Islamic Jihad, who certainly don't have the highest technological prowess in their rocket system. But certainly we didn't see the massive riots, the massive reaction that some warned. What we did see diplomatically is quite a large reaction. We did hear from the EU, we did hear from Israel's Arab allies, obviously also its opponents and enemies obviously also got on that. And we also heard from the US a condemnation. What's interesting here is that everyone keeps on talking about the status quo and how Itamar Ben-Gvir's visit violated the status quo. Well, actually it didn't. He didn't. He went up, he didn't pray, he walked around. Jews are allowed to go up. And also he's not the first minister, and he's not even the first internal security minister to go up. Gilad Erdan, when he was internal security minister, also went up to the Temple Mount. Certainly it is a bit different because Itamar Ben-Gvir is more of a quote unquote firebrand, more of a controversial figure, but certainly nothing in the status quo, which everyone has been referring to around the world, was broken, because Jews are allowed to go up to the Temple Mount, Jews are allowed to walk around the Temple Mount, Jews, according to the status quo, are not allowed to pray. There was nothing in his visit that suggested that he prayed on the Temple Mount. He went up, as I said, 12 to 30 minutes, and then he came down. So there's a sort of irony that the world is talking about status quo that actually wasn't broken. What we hear now is that the Security Council, at the behest of the Palestinians, will discuss this violation of the status quo, as they call it. The Jordanians and the Emiratis will be bringing this up, but the Americans, it seems, have understood that they're, that not to make anything actionable out of this discussion. Finally, coming from the Knesset only a couple of hours ago, there is a bit of optimism from the opposition. I met with people in the opposition, the coalition, because it's been a very difficult week for the coalition. The coalition, as I said, this is one which, I wouldn't say it's ideologically conformist, that everyone believes the same things, but one would think this is a government, with no other options. Every party in there, this is their best case scenario, et cetera, et cetera. But what we can see even from the first week is a war of words. There's a lot of mistrust there. The ultra-Orthodox parties within themselves are sniping each other. The ultra-Orthodox parties sniping at the Religious Zionist Party. Gafni, the leader of the Lithuanian non-Hasidic part of the United Torah Judaism, slammed Itamar Ben-Gvir for going up in the Temple Mount, arguing, and from his point of view, this is what his rabbis say, is that it's forbidden on Jewish law. Interestingly, the Hasidic part didn't say anything because their rabbis are far more gray, let's say. It's more of a gray area whether they can go up or not. Even within the Religious Zionist Party or the Otzma Yehudit, they're sniping. No one trusts anyone. There's a lot of disagreement, and it seems that there's a lot of disappointment, mistrust with Netanyahu. Netanyahu in himself has a few rebels within his party. At least 2 Likud members didn't turn up today. It didn't really hurt them. There wasn't any significant votes, and they still have a significant majority. But if that group within the Likud, dissatisfied people within the Likud, grows, it could cause Netanyahu problems down the road. I would say legislatively, not necessarily on the basis of taking down the government, because I don't think anyone within the Likud would dare do that. One can imagine a political backlash or something like that. But certainly what we've seen in less than a week since the swearing in of this government, since the ceremonial change of ministers that happened throughout all the ministers, there's been a lot of mistrust and a lot of sniping. So there are voices in the opposition who are a lot more optimistic about the situation than they were a week ago. And I heard that from one of the leaders of the opposition today. But people in the coalition understand that they may not like each other, but this is the only partners that they'll have, because, as I said, no one will want to bring down this government from in the coalition. There are no real other options to the right to bring someone in, and they're always worried that Netanyahu's end game is to bring in Benny Gantz. So we'll have to see what happens with that, but certainly a very, very interesting week, lots of issues, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks so much. The first one is from Reuven Hawk, just going back to the basics. What constitutes a basic law? How is a basic law enacted, and how many votes are required to pass a basic law?
61. It has to be an absolute majority, and it has to be stated that this is a basic law. And as I said, you need 61 to pass a law and to amend a law. That's basically what the difference is, because any law just needs a majority. Some laws are passed like 5 votes to 0 because no one really cares about it and no one really shows up for the law. It could be a relatively meaningless law. I would say meaningless because there's obviously always a reason for legislation, but that is not a basic law. It has to have a majority of 61.
Thank you so much. David Levine asks, so far, Netanyahu has been firm on insisting that the LGBTQT rights will not be in jeopardy, despite the homophobic comments of some of the religious cabinet members. Do you think Netanyahu can actually prevent Israel from backsliding on the rights?
I don't believe there'll be any significant rights that will be changed. Well, I mean, like, for example, one of the things that was changed immediately with the new health minister is that don't forget, during the last government, the health minister was from the Meretz party, openly gay, Nitan Horowitz, and he changed on medical forms, I think from father and mother to parent 1 and parent 2. And there was a bit of outrage, as one can imagine, from the conservative right, the religious right on this. So one of the first things the new health minister did was cancel that and return to father and mother. I think we'll see a lot of things like that. We won't, and maybe, again, I don't want to belittle anything, and I'm just guessing on a lot of this stuff, but I don't think there'll be any significant curve on the rights of the LGBTQ community. They'll be able to parade. I'm sure the parade in Jerusalem will be a little bit more tense than in previous years, but the parade in Tel Aviv, which is the biggest in the Middle East, which has, I think, tens of thousands of people, will go ahead with the same level of gusto as it has in previous years. Don't forget the new Speaker of the Knesset, who's the 3rd highest official in Israel, is openly gay. And Likud, has been declared by Netanyahu is a liberal, a liberal right-wing party, and it's committed to freedom, etc., etc. So I don't think there'll be any major changes, any major infringements on the rights of that community. Again, there may be some changes, again, I don't want to use the word minor change, because for some it's a very important issue, but I think, there'll be less significant changes, I'm sure, because many of the ministers, if not most of the ministers involved here, are now religious, whether on the far conservative right of the religious Zionist community or the ultra-Orthodox community. So certainly some of these things that were done in the last government will be overturned, but it won't infringe significantly on the rights of the LGBTQ community.
Thank you so much. Brock Korkmaz asks, what do you think about the UN General Assembly's latest resolution on Israel, especially about the Abraham Accords countries taking position against Israel? And Eric follows up, what effect would this legal decision have on Israel?
Well, it's a decision to ask the ICJ to form an opinion on Israel's control over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Palestinian territories, whatever you call it. It's a problematic first step in a deeply problematic series that could really have major significant ramifications for the state of Israel. We're still at an early stage. It could be that the ICJ decide not to deal with the issue, decide to put off the issue, decide to deal with different levels of the issue, could go even further. Some are worried, even though I believe that the term apartheid wasn't used in the resolution, that the ICJ can add it on later. So it is very problematic. I've spoken before about the difference between bilateral relations and multilateral relations. I don't want to go too deep into that again, but Israel has very good relations with countries who will vote perennially against Israel at the UN, partly because it just suits them, partly because It helps them when they decide they want positions, because there's only one Jewish state, whereas there's 22 Arab states, 57 Muslim states, part of a wider grouping of what used to be called non-aligned. So you tend to vote in blocks for political reasons, but also because it's just, what is Israel going to do? You know, the voting, certainly the voting pattern certainly did improve on that vote as to the previous one. And Netanyahu liked to tout a moral victory, the fact that a lot more countries voted against this and abstained, as in the previous one. But it's more of a moral victory. The fact is that the process is developing, and it is being sent to the ICJ. So certainly that is something which really worries the Israeli government. So they'll be working a lot on that. And now they have a full-time foreign minister for the first time in a while. So he will be focused certainly on that process.
Thank you so much. Eric asks, why does Jordan, etc., have issues with Jews going on the Temple Mount? Isn't this a violation of freedom of religion?
Well, that's a very tricky issue. Basically, Jordan considered themselves and were made the custodians of the Temple Mount as part of the Jordan-Israel peace treaty from 94, I think it was. Jordan, don't forget, Jordan occupied Jerusalem from 1949 to 1967. And for them, they'd like to be the custodians. It gives them a lot of prestige in the Arab and Muslim world. And, you know, if you go up to the Temple Mount, you can see that there's pictures of the Jordanian flag on pretty much, at least many of the signs on top of the Temple Mount itself, which really speaks to their, you know, their feeling that they are the custodians. They're the ones who employ the Waqf. They're the ones who make a lot of decisions, and they're the keepers, let's say, of the status quo. So it's not really, for them, it's not a matter of freedom of religion. They believe, Muslims, certain Muslims, I should say, believe that there should only be, in Muslim holy places, only Muslims should have the right to pray. Christians, Jews, and others should not have a right to pray. Don't forget, Jews, Christians, and others are not allowed to go into Mecca or Medina. So here it's a bit more tricky, obviously, because they're not sovereign in reality. So there is this, what's called the status quo, where Jews are allowed to go up, but they're not allowed to pray. Is that against the freedom of religion? One could certainly make that case, as is made by proponents of people going up to the Temple Mount. But it's against what's loosely been called the status quo. And again, I would suggest that nothing Itamar Ben-Gvir did earlier this week was against the status quo, but this status quo, which most people don't even know what it is, let's be honest, it's used sort of, you know, as a battering ram against anything that goes on, considering, you know, Hamas hold rallies there, kids play football up there, you know, people are harassed, stones are thrown from there onto the Western Wall, you know, there's been shooting and fireworks attacks on police up there. That's never considered against the status quo, but having Jews simply go up and walk around in the outside perimeter is considered against the status quo. And you'll always see Palestinian media talk about the settlers are storming Al-Aqsa. Well, none of them go anywhere near inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, and no one's storming. You walk leisurely around the outside perimeter, but that's the way it's framed. It is such an emotive issue for the Arab world, and especially the extremists amongst it like to make it an explosive issue. And Jordan very much feels that it, as I said, in its custodian role, it must speak out at every opportunity on this issue.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Eli Cohen asked, as reported in the Epoch Times, Israel is moving support towards Russia and away from support for Ukraine. Is this the stated position of the Israeli government?
No, first of all, you would never state that, whatever it is. No, but there will certainly be a slight difference, I think, in the way that the conflict is related to. Even between the Bennett and Lapid premiership, there was a difference. You know, Bennett tried very much to be seen as a power broker, not criticize Russia too much. He even went, even on the Sabbath, if you remember, he flew to Moscow because he felt that it was so important to be a mediator, etc., etc. One can argue if that was successful or that was just a ruse. by Putin. That's certainly up for debate. But Lapid was very much more critical as a prime minister and even as a foreign minister before of Vladimir Putin, of the war, defending Ukraine, etc., etc. If we remember, Netanyahu touts very much his credentials, his relationship he did in the past with leaders around the world, and Vladimir Putin was one that he very much talked about. This was, again, I should stress, this was before the invasion. I think Netanyahu would take a far more measured response, and that was even alluded to by the opening speech of the new foreign minister, Eli Cohen, that they will take I don't know exactly what the language they used, but basically it gave a hint to that they will not be as open, be critical of Moscow. Don't forget, we've talked about this many times. Israel is in a bit of a difficult situation because Russia very much controls what goes on in Syria. It's very much its relationship with Iran. So Israel can't afford, let's say some of the statements and what some other countries way outside of that, challenge can do. Israel has a relationship with Russia because Russia is on its doorstep. Russia prevents Iran from being literally on Israel's doorstep. And the fact that Israel continues to go into places like Syria and others to ensure that weapons does not reach Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations means that the relationship that the Jewish state has with Russia is a lot more complex than just sort of taking a side. That's geodiplomacy. So I think Netanyahu has a lot more, let's just say, has a lot more experience, has a lot closer relationship historically with Vladimir Putin. And for him, his major goal is to make sure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. If the one message that's been brought out in every single statement from Netanyahu, from the government, is that is their goal. And Russia is a very important player, and that's part of the P5+1. It's a major power. It's growing its relationship with Iran. Iranian drones are being used in the conflict against Russia. So Israel cannot afford to poke Russia in the eye, especially when Iranian nuclear weapons capability could be just around the corner. So I think with all those elements, yes, there'll be a more circumspect approach towards Russia in this government than perhaps there was in the last one.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Nicholas Damas discussing Care Almost Canceled My College Class. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.